Well, welcome back, guys. Today we're going to talk about servicing of the rear differential. So this piece right here is usually overlooked a lot by people because it's not something that people really feel comfortable doing, but the task itself is very simple. So behind this cover, there's a set of gears, and what they do is they take input from the propeller shaft and they put it onto a thing called a ring gear, what we'll see in a minute inside there, and it rotates the axles and makes the vehicle move. So there's gear oil inside of here. So what gear oil is, it's actually like a thicker based oil that has what they call a high stiction rate. So the oil is really thick, and it allows it to kind of coat all the moving components in there. And this fluid is usually good for about 50,000 miles or so, but you have to kind of look at your manufacturer and see what they say that they want to kind of replace it at. But I usually have a good rule of thumb, about 50 to 60,000 miles, which is about the intervals that they have like major service procedures on our vehicles, and I just kind of recommend doing that. But we'll get down to it real quick. So on the front here, so this is a Chrysler unit. So Jeep, Chrysler, Dodge, they tend to use these, and they have what they call an inspection plug in the front. So this is used to check the fluid level, but also to fill it. But right now, with the vehicle being up in the air, the axle has dipped down a little bit. So what will happen is the fluid level will have raised. So typically when we check the level, we'll do it on the ground, and we'll jack the rear end up to kind of put some weight on it so it's more level. But essentially you want the fluid level to be kind of halfway in between the axle tubes and here. But if I pull this plug out, I'll show you what I mean. So if you just take a flathead screwdriver, you can come in behind this plug, and you should be able just to kind of pull it out of here. But you'll notice that the fluid is starting to come out of there. And the fluid itself is pretty brown. It's pretty dark in color. Usually this is like an amber color, almost like the color of engine oil. And what we're also looking for is we're looking for any liquid that isn't oil. Looking for water or something along those lines if this axle was like submerged. So if you have a vehicle that you're towing with, you may run into that. So you want to kind of do a little further inspection. But this actually looks pretty good because so far I'm not seeing any what they call intermixing. So there isn't any difference in color. It's more uniform than anything. But what we'll do is we'll take the surrounding bolts off the cover, and then we'll come behind it and we'll just pry it off a little bit, and it will allow for us to drain the rest of the oil out of this. So for this vehicle, you need a 13 millimeter socket, and I'm just going to use a power tool to kind of take this off. I mean, you can use a regular ratchet if you wanted to. I'm just going to take these bolts out. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put one on the top in just loosely, so just a couple of turns by hand, and that's just going to be so that I can pry this cover off and not have it fall on me. So you can usually take a little flat blade screwdriver and kind of work your way around the cover and the axle. Slowly kind of break the seal. Sometimes you got to come in with a gasket scraper or a thin blade just to kind of get behind it. But once you kind of get it crack free, so you notice the top stayed up there, I'm just going to come in with my little and get this to come free. So all that fluid just came out. Now all I need to do is I can pull this remaining bolt out, and then we can see the inside of here. And you can kind of see from here that the fluid level is right about there. It's about halfway where it should be. And what we're looking for is we're looking for debris inside of this cover. So I'm looking for any like heavy chunks of anything or anything that's kind of discolored. It's got a little bit of a gray color to it, which is somewhat normal because you'll have these pieces here. This is called your ring gear, and then there's a gear further in which is called the pinion gear. They tend to wear on each other, and then what I'm doing is I'm just going to make sure that the inside of this case feels okay. It's got a little bit of different coloring, but this has been sitting for a little bit, so some of the stuff will settle. But we'll go through and we'll clean this all out, and then we'll be able to clean the cover off I'll show you guys how to put some new sealant on this. So right now you can see that this big kind of blob around here. Somebody put an absorbent amount of sealant on this, but you don't really need to do that. A little goes a long way in these applications. So I'm just going to wipe out most of the stuff that's in there, and then what we'll do is we'll take a little a wash tank and we'll wash this out with some solvent. Typically you can use like a brake cleaner or degreaser type of cleaner to come in here and clean all this off. And while we're in here, we'll typically be inspecting these teeth, so these pieces right here, and we're kind of looking to see if there's any chips or missing pieces, or if there is too much what they call backlash. So what that is that's the movement of this with the other gear inside of there. So all we really want to do is make sure that all the debris and anything that's inside of here we can kind of clean out, and then that'll just make it so that the new fluid will last a little bit longer, and it makes it so that you can inspect all the pieces in here and see if there's anything that needs to be serviced further. So what we'll do is we'll just get a kind of initial wash inside here, and then what we'll need to do is clean this outer edge here where you see all the red. So what that is that's just a sealant that was put on there, and we just need to make sure that we clean that surface, and then we got to clean the cover itself so that all of these surfaces are clean, so we can put some new sealant on top of there. So I'm just gonna pretty much wash out the grease so that way we can get all this off. So I've got a little scuff pad here. So this is just they call it a Scotch-Brite pad, and you should be able just to kind of come through and just scuff the surface and get any of that sealant to come off. I'm going to use a little wire brush on a drill just to kind of speed up the process. So it's kind of the same deal here. So this is our cover that we were talking about, and you can kind of see now that it's a little bit cleaned up, like all this heavy amounts of sealant that's on there. You don't want to have that much, because what can happen is that can actually get inside the gearing, and it can ruin bearings and things along those lines. So you just want to be kind of mindful that you're just putting just enough what you need. So I just got a scraper here. It's got a little bit of a razor sharp edge on it, and I'm just going to go through and I'm just going to cut off kind of the heavy pieces. Let's see what I can get scraped off real quick. There. Now I'm just going to do the same thing with the wire brush and just come through and just clean up that surface. You start to see it's a pretty big improvement of this surface versus that. So I'll just work around. I got it all wire wheeled. I'm just going to wash it off again in the wash tank. So now with this cleaned up, what I want to do is I want to inspect the cover a little bit closer. So the things I've noticed is people overlook, especially with a car that's got some higher mileage that might have been serviced a few times before, is that these covers, if you don't tighten them down the right way, or if you have too much adhesive sealant in there or something along those lines, what it can do is it can actually like buckle the flange. So the flange, what I mean is this whole piece right here. So you can kind of see where the bolts are. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that this surface is flat across the bolt hole, and I'm just going to kind of do that. I'm going to eyeball all of them just to make sure that they all look relatively flat across. And if they didn't, then what you could do is you could just take this, you could put this on a flat surface and, you know, hit this flange with a hammer to kind of flatten down those holes. Typically you see that on covers that are a little bit thinner. This is actually a pretty thick cover, so probably wouldn't have that happen to it. But like I said, I made sure I just kind of cleaned up here where that plug goes in, and I'm just going to make sure that this is good and cleaned off before we try to put it back in. So I'm just going to take a little bit of brake parts washer. And I'm just going to wash this down a little bit with that. All right, so now we're at the time where we need to put a sealant on this cover. So what I like to use is just some black RTV, and what that is that's a liquid sealant, and how it works is it's called room temperature vulcanizing fluid, and what it does is at room temperature this will start to harden once it comes out of the container. So you just want to make sure that you're keeping in mind of how long you've been doing this. Typically you have about 10 to 15 minute work time before it starts to really harden up. But just look on the container and just make sure you're kind of looking and see how long it actually has before it's fully solidified. So if you take the cap off, there's a little piece in the back side of the cap that you can go through, and you can break the seal inside here. They give you this tip where you can actually use this to put the sealant on uniformly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut a little bit off with a razor blade. What I like to do is just make a little angle on that so that I can spread this out pretty evenly. And how we put this on is we want to kind of draw around, and I want to go around the bolt holes, and then I'm going to connect in between. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow for the oil to be sealed out from the bolt holes so nothing kind of comes out of this cover. So I'm just going to slowly start to work this around. And you don't have to do really heavy on this, about a 1/8 inch or so bead that will kind of go all the way around is probably more than sufficient. So once you go all the way around the bolt holes, now it's just like connecting the dots. So I'll just come make a line, comes across. And then all I'm going to do now is I'm just going to use my finger, and I'm just going to even it out so that it's more so uniform all the way around. Make sure that I get good coverage around all those bolt holes. I'll just do this around the whole cover real quick. So just looking at the bolts that hold this in place, I'm just making sure that the bolt threads are clean and it doesn't have any of the sealant on it, and I'm also making sure the end of it doesn't have any. So like this one where it has some on it, if you run this into the hole, what can happen is if it's what they call a blind hole, so it doesn't have a hole all the way through, it stops. If you have RTV that gets inside of there and you try to tighten it, you can do what they call hydro blocking it, and what it will do is it'll try to press and it can actually break the case or crack it. So I just want to make sure that I do that. So I'll just wire wheel these all down real quick and get all that residual piece off. The bolt's cleaned up and the cover ready to go on. I'm just going to make sure that I clean up the surface one last time, make sure it's clean and dry. There isn't any oil on the mating surface, so otherwise the seal won't adhere. All right, now that the seal surface is clean and we have our cover that has our gasket applied to it, we'll just put this in place. And then with our bolts, we'll just make sure that we put these all in by hand first. So I usually will start with the top and the bottom one just to kind of get it centered. get the rest of them in. So now that all the bolts are in by hand, I'm just going to go in with an electric tool on the lowest setting, and I'm just going to run all the bolts in. So I'm going to start from the bottom, and I'm going to go to the top. So bottom, the top, and I'm going to kind of do a crisscross pattern until I get to all the way around. And what that will do is that will make sure that this cover seats in all the way around evenly. Now that those are all run down, I'm just going to make sure I go back in with a ratchet, and I'm just going to make sure I snug all these up the rest of the way. These don't require a whole lot of pressure to tighten them, or torque as we'll call it. So I just like to make sure that I go around these a couple times, because usually that liquid sealant will start to kind of move its way around and settle into the holes. So if you can just go back over it at least 2 times, you'll know that this is tight. Like I said before, you don't have to go crazy trying to crank these bolts on. Then what you want to do is just let this sit for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll add fluid into it. Alright, so the last thing to do now is to just fill this with fluid. So now that you have the vehicle on level ground, so we have it here on an alignment rack, I'm just going to take a suction gun that I've filled with gear oil. So this vehicle takes a 75 W90. Just make sure you're looking up what it is, and you're just going to keep filling this up until the fluid comes right to where that hole is, and it may even come out of it just a little bit. So you can see now that the fluid level is right at the full line. It's actually starting to stream out of this just a little bit. So that would be okay, or just below that is fine as well. Once you do that, you can just take your plug, make sure your plug's fully seated in, and then you can just clean up the cover and wipe it down. And that's pretty much it for the service. I hope this video was helpful, and I hope to see you guys again real soon. Thanks so much for watching.